Okay, Ecclesiastes chapter 10. We're looking at the wise and not so wise this morning. We skipped over last Wednesday night because we had some special activity. But Solomon now is continuing his observations of life. And of course, he's reverting back to his former days of Proverbs and so forth, things that he has learned. And we've seen that he's gone from that morbid state of hating life, and he's tried everything. And I think I like the Johnny Bench, who was a great catcher for the Cincinnati Reds. But I liked him even more as a radio announcer. I didn't like the Reds, but he would describe pitches that that would come in, and he would name different songs or different things. He'd say, and the one that I remember is the Peggy Lee fastball. And Peggy Lee was a singer back in the 50s and 60s who one of her most famous songs was "Is That All There Is?" And so that's what, it was a Peggy Lee fastball. Is this all there is? And so, I think that's what Solomon is now as he's looked at life and he's gone out the deep end and tried to have all the pleasures that money could buy, all the knowledge that money could buy, all the relationships that money could buy. And he says, is this all there is? And now he's coming back as an older man, as a fool that has now found fellowship with God again. But I think it's like so many men that I meet today, so many people that I meet today, where they went to church as kids. And really, my generation, we were the Pepsi generation. We were the future. You heard all this kind of stuff. And, climb every mountain and all those different songs. And, we were the hope of the world and all this youth groups and all these things that were so prevalent in my generation. But unfortunately, my generation, and I ran into this time after time in my early ministry, I was forced to go to church, and I'm just not going to go to church, and my kids can decide. I'll raise them to decide for themselves. Well, those kids have decided for themselves because they've never had the options. They've never seen both sides of the situation. And so I never will forget, I had a pastor, or an evangelist, and he was preaching in my early ministry. And of course, you had baseball going on and so forth. And that was back right when the high schools and colleges and even little leagues were now starting to play sports on Sunday. That was something that was not happening in the South back in my early days. In fact, one time we went to a gym I remember as a teenager, and we were told we can't play on Sunday. Now, that was a public school gym that we were at, but other time we did go to parks and so forth. I'm not saying that it was always like that, but even the schools were closed. And so, but now I remember the evangelist speaking. He said, many of you fathers are dreaming that your sons are going to play professional sports, and you're training them, and you're putting sports in front of the church and in front of being faithful to God. And you're going to find that that when they get older, that they will not be playing sports, but neither will they be going to church. And he was so right. I look back on many of those families that, every once in a while I'll get a call from one of my some of my faithful people. You just love your people through two different states, not just love them to pieces. We ran across a letter from a lady that's with the Lord now that she just was telling us what a blessing, the ministry was and all that. But I was just thinking, and you look back and you see those kids and grandkids now, and how that their kids didn't go to church, and now their grandkids are off and all kinds of things. And then you see those who are faithful to the Lord, and they didn't all stay right there in that church, but now they still have an inclination to be in, for the things of the Lord. And they're spread out all over the world. And so you see that, the patterns. And this is what we see here in Ecclesiastes. Solomon sees patterns. He sees there's just certain things you can't change about people, and we saw that earlier in his studies. But now we're looking at verse 10 of chapter 10, or verse 8 of chapter 10, as he's going on. And what he's doing now, he's going to be coming to some conclusions as he gets into chapter 11 and 12. And, the whole thing is remember the Creator in the days of your youth. Don't do what I did. Remember the Creator, which is always, it's a powerful message, but it's a sad message. It's a lot better for a person to not to have to preach that way and say there was victory as youth, there was victory as a young person, there was victory. And yes, we've all had problems, but Jesus led me all the way. But we should see now, as we go back to verse 8 then he's going to just give us some basically wisdom and works. There are just certain things that whether you're saved or unsaved, it's true. And he's talking, first of all, about carelessness, and I call it Murphy's Law. He says anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And that's one thing we used to say about especially working with children. You make sure that you put up all the knives or anything sharp. You make sure you cover all the outlets. You do everything you can, because if it can go wrong, a child's going to figure out how to make it go wrong. Same with young people, same with in church. So Murphy's Law, what can go wrong will go wrong, so you've got to plan ahead to make sure that you look for those circumstances. Remember prudence. A prudent man looks, and he hides himself, where he covers himself before the event happens. And he's already talked about that. We talked about prudence earlier. But he says, he who digs a pit will fall into it. Why will he fall into it? Because he didn't put rails around it or whatever. Now, earlier in the book of Proverbs, he said, put a fence around your roof. And that was their patio, was to get up on the roof, because you didn't want people to fall over. Why? Because, the same way, when you go to parks, you'll see a lot of times a fence along the cliffs. How many times have I read now where a doctor just recently was out west somewhere, and he was taking pictures or whatever, and he fell over and killed himself because he got too close to there wasn't a fence there. Stone Mountain in Georgia was like that. I went up there one time, and they had a fence, but a man that I was with was telling me, he said, I'm so glad they put it up there, because that mountain just goes over, and you don't perceive that you're down, and you keep wanting to look over the bottom of it, but you get set down so far, and all of a sudden you're starting to slide, and you're going to go over and on down. And he said, I laid on my stomach, and fortunately I was far enough up that I was able to crawl back up. But he said, that was the closest I've ever come to dying. But now they got a fence there, so that's just, whatever will go wrong, will go wrong. And so he says, when you build a fence, you're going to fall into it if you don't watch it. So again, he says, that's just Murphy's Law. And whoever breaks through a wall will be bitten by a snake. So just go ahead and knock that wall down. You're strong enough, knock it down, but you better make sure that you know what's behind it. And what we say down south is, if you pick up a board, you better make sure that you kind of kick it first, because snakes are prevalent down there, and they love boards and they love tires and things like that. So you got to be careful, and you got to look ahead. If you don't, then you're going to fall into pits or whatever. So he says, and again, he who quarries stones or breaks stones, what's going to happen? You're going to be hurt by stones. And he who splits wood, guess what? You're going to be endangered by the chips or by the axe. And same way with, and one doesn't, then he talks about this is common sense. He says, if the axe is dull and one does not sharpen it, guess what? You're going to work a whole lot harder if you don't work smart. And so it's not so much that you spend a lot of time doing something, it's how smart that time is in what you're doing. And so he says, these are all things that I've learned along the way, things I've observed. And I saw a sign, I don't know, you always feel like a fool, but you'll see a little sign on a bumper sticker or whatever, and so you drive a little bit closer, or you let your car get up a little bit closer so you can read it. And I felt so stupid, because that's exactly what the the little sign said, it said, "You can't fix stupid." I go, "Oh no, he got me, you know." So you can't fix stupid. Uh, and so, and there again, same way with wet paint. What do? You don't touch it or whatever. So he says, a serpent might bite when it is not charmed. Hey, listen, you go ahead and have all the snake charmers and you say, oh, how great that is. But guess what? I mean, even though it won't bite, you think it won't bite, then it'll bite when it's charmed, and it'll bite when it's not charmed. So what's the key there? Stay away from snakes. Right? Basically, or if you know, you got to know what you're doing if you're going to play with snakes, or you're going to get bitten. He says a babbler is no different. Now, boy, that is something. So, how many times have we gotten in trouble by our mouths? What a fire a little tongue creates, as James chapter 2 says. And so a babbler, I mean, we get bitten many times by our own words. The words of a wise man's mouth are gracious, but the lips of a fool swallow him up. There again, that whole idea, oh, I wish I hadn't said that. So these are just proverbs that he's giving one after another. And we see that, so there's Murphy's Law, and that is wisdom and works. And then in verse 11, we see that that is wisdom and success, or he goes on from there, verses 11 through 12, 11 and 12. Stay away from the words that bite. It's like a snake. Be careful. Your mouth can cause a lot of problems. And so be careful with that. Then verses 11 and 12 there. But then verses 13 through 15, he's saying words reflect a state of mind. Be careful with your words. And he goes, you'll see this all the way through, this passage. He says, the words of his mouth begin with foolishness, and the end of his talk is raving madness. So a person who doesn't know how to control their mouth, and they just, what's that term that they use on the internet now? They melt down or whatever, or the rants. And man, people get on the internet now, and they just say some of the silliest or the most foolish things. And, someone has said, what is it? The internet is permanent. Whatever you say on there, you can't take back. And now they're going back and finding things that people said or wrote, of course, or dictated or whatever, that 10 years ago, and they're incriminated now by what they said, or just a little like that somebody puts on something. He says, the words of his mouth, or the fool's mouth, is just filled with foolishness. And the end of his talk is a rant or a raving madness. We want to be careful with our mouth. We want to be careful with what we say. Words have meaning, as we hear today. But so again, he's talking about the things he's been. Remember, he grew up in a harem. His mother looks like the favorite wife, Solomon. But he saw a lot of things that went on in the palace, all the political intrigue. Can you imagine having all those half-brothers and half-sisters by 999 more mothers? I mean, I don't think all of them had children, but, let's say only 40 of them had children. Perish the thought. But, excuse me, I'm sorry, that's Solomon. That was, his father had only about a dozen wives, as far as we know. But even with that, that'd be too many. But what did he do? Like father, like son. If my dad could have, boy, if he had his pleasures, I could have even more. But his mother, of course, was Bathsheba. And he had brothers that were older than him, full brothers, and then he had a whole lot of half-brothers and sisters. And so you can imagine a lot of things he learned. And one thing he learned on that palace court was when to keep his mouth shut. You think? Have you ever learned that in your family, even though you don't have the harem? Sometimes it's best to keep your mouth shut. And then he has seen can you imagine the squabbling that went on? even in his own father's court, all the different things. And he had learned, there's just certain people that are fools, and they don't know when to shut up. And you got to learn how to do that if you're going to survive on a dog-eat-dog world. And so here he's saying, and then of course you got to prepare, you got to keep your iron sharp, your axe sharp, and so forth. So these are wisdom and words. And he says a fool, verse 14, also multiplies words. No man knows what he is to be. Who can tell him what will be after him? So he says, what can this happen? Or he thinks out loud, and he's thinking ahead, and he's asking advice and all this, and yet he's not really thinking it through before he talks. And the one thing I've learned is if you talk, people can give you a lot of advice. But a lot of it is from fellow fools. And so he's saying, and we just keep babbling and talking and so forth. And sometimes it's best to listen. Then again, notice the labor of fools. He talks about wisdom and words. Verse 15, the labor of fools worries them, for they do not even know how to go to the city. That is not a euphemism, but a colloquialism. We would say they wouldn't even know how to come out of the rain. I mean, he's saying they didn't, as a farmer, everybody knows how to get to the city. But a fool doesn't even know how to come out of the rain. And so this would be, he says, just there again, you just can't fix stupid. And one of the things he is learning is that you just can't change human nature. Okay, now that is what he's coming up with. But what do we say as Christians with a Christian perspective to this worldly perspective? Can God change people? Can he change their hearts? Can he change their speech? I just love to see people, and I was thinking of somebody on the way to church this morning, and I was thinking that person was such a blessing to my ministry. But recently I found out, because of certain things I had to find out if it was part of the family or whatever, but that person, before I met them, had a horrible life. I mean, they would be the Saturday night people down at the bars. And the person always told me, Pastor, you don't know really how to appreciate grace unless you've been through what I've through. And I would say, oh yeah, but I mean, it couldn't have been that bad because look how good you are now. I mean, I just never saw that until I had to, the person's family member filled me in on some things of the reason why a certain situation was today. And it was about their children. And that person went through a lot of problems with their children. We always prayed for their children, but I didn't know why. But a lot of the things that person was paying for was the bar scene. Being where they were in their early lives. And yet, did God change? Did God fix stupid? So much. Yes, he did. But like Solomon, they paid a horrible price for the time that they were living away from God. And how sad that is. Now, as I get older, the more I could look back on my life and see, oh, Lord, thank you for putting up with me. Thank you, Lord, for my neglect. I didn't realize how silly I was at times, or immature. And you get to those rites of passage in your life where you realize, hey, I'm not a young man anymore. And then I realized that another thing I was thinking about, those rites of passage. When I got here, I'd always been one that just the older people loved me. I just have a way with old folks. But early in my ministry here, I realized that some of the older people were looking at me as old. I'm going, wait a minute, I'm still the young preacher and all this stuff. And I all of a sudden, now these older ladies and all that, and wait a minute, these people are people that, and they're retired and they're on pensions and all that kind of stuff. And they're looking at me like, you're not so much younger than I am. I'm going, whoa, I'm an old man now. That bothered me. Oh man, did that bother? I cried for 2 days, just all of a sudden, you're different. But then you can look back and as an older person, you can say, man, I can't believe how I was and what some of these older folks must have thought at me. And I imagine some of them probably said, you can't fix stupid, or whatever. But there again, how many silly things we look back on the older we get. And I could really get on a pity party, folks, because I've done a lot of crazy things. How about you? But that's why I have to say, forgetting those things which are past and pressing toward the mark of the prize of the high calling of Christ, of God in Christ Jesus. And so, Lord, I can't help what I was, but I'm not what I want to be. I'm not what I should be. I'm not what I want to be. But praise the Lord, I'm not what I used to be, or whatever, that term. And so, yeah, we grow in grace, and we all see, and Solomon is looking at things, and he says, yeah, there's a lot of crazy people out there, but unfortunately I was one of them. And so he's saying these things now, and wisdom and words. But then the wisdom and ways. So we looked at the wisdom and works as far as just, you got to have wisdom to know how to do things, or you're going to hurt yourself. And your words, if you don't do that, you're going to look like a fool. But now let's look at the wisdom of ways. And immature leaders, he gets back to leaders again. And of course, he was one. In verse 16, where he says, woe, O land, when your king is a child. Now remember, he was a child, or a very young man, whenever he became king. And he had older brothers. Some of them might have been old enough to almost to be his father. And yet, God chose him as king. But he says, so he wasn't condemning. Of course, we know Josiah and others were like 6 years old, and one of them was Joash. Jehoshaphat. One of them was 6 months old whenever they became king. But we see here that he says, immature leaders lack discipline will. So he's not talking about a child so much as he's talking about childish men. The difference between a man and a boy is the price of his toys and all that kind of stuff. I meet people all the time that are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s, now that I'm older. And I have to deal with them like they're 13-year-old kids. They have no discipline. I mean, they got toys, and they got a lot of problems because of what they've been able to do with their money and time. But maturely, they're still looking for the best, for the next fix, for the next fun, or whatever. And they've never really settled down. And he says, immature leaders lack disciplined wills. And that's very true. That's why he's saying, well, when your king thinks like a child, be very careful. And your princes feast in the morning. So they're partying all the time. And they're just looking for a party. You know, some of the leaders that we have in our country today, and members of God, they scare me because they got a lot of influence. But that's exactly what we're seeing here. I mean, they want the responsibility, or at least they want the acclaim. They want to be the influencers or whatever, but they don't have the personal discipline in their own lives. And that's true with a lot of the older generation too. You look at some of the things that are going on. The leadership in this country today scares me because we got people that are, I think of some of these conservatives, and I'm a conservative, but I'm thinking, man, this guy, this woman, or this guy, they're really thinking ahead, and they say all the right things, and I'm kind of listening to them, and they got the right philosophy. Then you're finding out that they are swapping wives and all kinds of other things. They're running around with some newscaster and then you look at the newscaster, you think, this is really one that I really like. And then you're finding out they're in all kinds of crazy things that's going on in their lives. And you say, where are the adults in the room? And doesn't some of the rhetoric that we're hearing in the news and in our national debates, doesn't it reflect our childishness? And look at the undisciplined. I mean, just if you hate somebody, just start ranting at them again. And the flame throwing that's going on with the words today, it's frightening, isn't it? We're living with a bunch of children who don't know how to control themselves, and whether it's your neighbor or our governor. I don't really like him, but I'm not, whatever state you're in, whatever governor, or whether it's your president. And I'm not saying this president or whatever, but you understand, it's scary when you see that when you got judges and everybody acting like children. And that's what he's saying here. He says, the princes feast in the morning. That's all they're looking for is pleasure. Blessed are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobles. Now, does that say that you have to be part of the nobility? No, he's not saying that. He says that they are sons of nobles in the sense, was David noble? Yes. Was he a noble? No. He was the eighth son of a sheep herder. So he couldn't say, daddy, because he's just one generation removed from the baby son of a sheep herder. He's talking about blessed, but did his dad become noble? Or he was noble. And so he says, blessed are you, O land, when you have nobles, when you have men of nobility, men of maturity, men who have character and stand right from wrong. That's what nobility and what true nobility is all about. And your princes feast at the proper time, so they're disciplined. And there again, food and so forth. He's mentioning kind of a discipline. He's talking about a disciplined life. He says, for strength and not for drunkenness. So they feast. Their food is they eat to live rather than live to eat. That's discipline, isn't it? So he says, people who have purpose, people who have character. The writer, or Paul says in Romans chapter 1, that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, and neither were they thankful, but they gave themselves over. And so what did God do? He gave them over to reprobate minds, to fulfill the lust of the flesh. Okay, you want to go to the ways of the flesh? Go that route. And of course, you get into all the perversions that we have today. And that's true in any society. And so these are eternal truths that he is saying. So he says, they eat and for strength and not for drunkenness or for gluttony or whatever else. So they have disciplined lives. And then he says, and then he gets into laziness. And of course, he said a lot about that in Proverbs. He said, I pass by the field of the sluggard and so forth. But he says, because of laziness, the building decays, and through idleness of hands, the house leaks. So they lack discipline even in their personal gains. And a feast is made for laughter, and wine makes merry. But money answers everything. Now, what is he saying? He's speaking as a fool, right? Does money answer everything? No, the love of money is the root of all evil. But to a fool, if I just had more money, and we were just talking about something earlier today with you, and you were saying this person is really going after the money. But all the money does is cause clashes. And will that person be happy if they get all the money in the world? What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Solomon had all the money, and the one thing he learned, if anything, was that this verse is wrong, or this is that money doesn't solve all the problems. There again, I would like to find that out personally, but we all would, wouldn't we? But there again, God is. I'm a rich man. I'm richer than 60% of the people in all the world. And and this church budget that we have is not even. I think it's on par with the average income of a person. So we're talking about the whole church budget. And yet God has blessed everything I've needed. And so I'm a rich man, and I'm richer than 60% of the people in the world, and I don't make a whole lot of money. But oh my, God has ways of meeting needs, doesn't he? And enriching souls and lives. And I would much rather have what I have than what Solomon had. I still can't figure out. I love my wife, and she's got me running up and down the stairs because we're trying to clean out things downstairs. I love her to pieces. But if I had 1,000 of them, I think I'd be going crazy. God didn't. God wired me for a 110, not a 220 or whatever. Remember that? I'm going to trade her in for 220s. You're not even wired for 110, whatever. So there again, when you get outside of God's timing and his systems, money, I mean, you could have as much money as Elon Musk. I don't really think Elon Musk is that happy. He's driven to keep on going. How can you be happy with 14 kids by 6 or 7 different wives? And sooner or later, it's showing up with his kids, if it hasn't already. And same way with all of us. I mean, and I don't want my kids are not perfect. And I don't want to get into, oh, look at me, I'm a good, no. Each one of us have our problems. And my kids have their problems. And most of their problems I look at and I want to cry because they come from their daddy. Oh no, they got the same weaknesses I got, So we all pass them on, don't we? Only thing I did have a reprieve this past, I think my daughter put something on the internet. The older I get, the more I'm coming like my mother. And so I don't know whether she was saying that as, well, we won't get into that. Now I got my wife wondering about things. You want to see that? Okay, then you could figure out whether she was positive or negative about that. But there again, we all got problems. But the one thing I found out that I got problems that money can't solve. And notice that the fool says, if I just had more money, that'll solve everything. And isn't that where look at the national budget today. If we just had more money, it's going to solve all the problems. Just throw money at it. And we're finding out all the graft and corruption that's caused by that very attitude. So then he says, the wise and not so wise. And so let's be wise. Do not curse the king even in your thought. Why? Because attitudes are caught and not thought. And so what I mean by that is what as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. I mean, if you despise the king, sooner or later it starts oozing out of your pores. When add the big A, attitudes, is so important. And sometimes it's undetectable or you can't detect it. But sooner or later that person's bad attitude is going to come out, especially with leadership or whatever else. He says, don't curse the king, even in your thought. Be careful with the way you think about it. Now, that doesn't mean you can not disagree with him. But when you start thinking, but now notice the progression. As the more you think, do not curse the rich, even in your bedroom. So don't curse the rich, even in your bedroom. For a bird of the air may carry your voice, and the bird in flight may tell the matter. You start talking out loud, and somebody's got to pick it up. Somebody, even in your private life, is going to say things. And whether it's in, so sooner or later, people are going to find out what you're thinking. So keep the big A, keep the good attitude. And so notice, these are all just things that he comes along with. He says, I've learned, I've learned under the sun. There's just certain things that are for the saved and the unsaved alike. One of the things we got to realize that when we, again, with young people, you're 16, but you're a Christian and you should be different. A 16-year-old boy is going to be a 16-year-old boy whether he's a Christian or not. Same way with a girl. They're going to be foolish or not. But now one thing you want them to have is the Lord Jesus in their heart. because God can do something that you can't. And so these are just things that are true in human nature. And does a 16-year-old Christian boy that's living for the Lord, can he dig a pit and still fall in it? Yeah. Can I, as a father or a man now, a grandfather, can I use dull tools? Yeah. Do I have to keep things sharp? Yes. But then I have to make sure that if they're sharp, I have to make sure they don't cut me. All the different things. These are just things that are under the sun. You can't change them. But he says you can't fix stupid, but you can learn from those who are. And so now he's kind of gone through this, and he's kind of giving you a lot of worldly wisdom. And now in chapter 11, he's going to start coming back to, hey, this is what you got to realize in life, men or people. There's just certain things that aren't worth it. And if you don't have the Lord in your life, life just isn't worth living. He's going to be coming to this. So we're going to see this all the way through now to chapter 12. Okay, we'll close here and have a word of prayer. And if there's any questions, we'll have that time.